They spoke of humans in hushed tones. Not in awe, but in fear. Not for their ships or their technology, those were crude by galactic standards, but for their will. For what they could do with scrap metal and stubbornness. For the fact that a bleeding human would grin through shattered teeth and keep crawling toward you with a grenade in each fist. The stories varied from system to system, but the tone never changed. Humanity was madness made flesh. Monsters wrapped in soft skin. Brutes with the cunning of devils and the morals of a black hole. The SCIFI archives, the greatest repository of interstellar knowledge in 3 sectors, recorded more than 6,000 distinct alien species. Only one was marked with the black sigil, Xenoform class Delta Null, strategic containment recommended. Homo sapiens. And now the mask was cracking. Scholar Emeritus Vural gently traced a claw tip across the interface slab. He was old for a thal, his crest feathers faded to ivory and movement stiff with degeneration of the inner vascular nodes. The translucent membrane across his eyes flickered as he scanned the interface, an old habit from his decades in the Deep Index division. The archive hall around him hummed softly, crystalline towers stretching overhead in a spiral of data light and flowing lexicon, lit with pale green neural currents that reflected off the obsidian tiles underfoot. Here, beneath 6 kilometers of lunar ice, were stored the deepest truths of the Concordat and the secrets too dangerous to see the stars again. He was not supposed to be in this wing. And even if he had permission, he was not supposed to activate the files he had just decrypted. The data fragment he'd uncovered 3 cycles prior had not originated from any known human database. It was too old. Pre-Union era. Likely one of the first contact caches, scrubbed but not sterilized during the Silent War. A misfiled shard of cultural telemetry routed through half a dozen dead satellites and a defunct relay station in the Pentris Rift. He'd expected military doctrine, threat assessments, more confirmation of the space orc narrative that had defined humanity for nearly a century. Instead, he'd found poetry. Translated into Thalvyx Common, the words lost some of their rhythm but not their fire. We are the bastards of Earth's last storm. Crawling from mud, bone, and silicon ash. We come not for peace. We come not for war. We come because we can. He hadn't believed it. Not at first. Then came the art. Primitive digital sketches from the early colonization efforts, archived with embedded metadata tags indicating they had never been intended for transmission. A child clinging to a dog as bombs fell in a burning sky. Soldiers shielding civilians with their own bodies as plasma struck their armor. A broken man lighting a candle in a ruined cathedral, a church. Vural corrected himself. The image file included the term Notre Dame. This was not Orcish. This was not the brute the galaxy had been taught to fear. This was human. And it stirred something in him. A memory long suppressed. Of a refugee barge drifting through the ether corridor, damaged and lost. Of a human vessel breaking protocol to board and give aid. He'd been a young Xenopsych scholar then. Too afraid to thank them. He never forgot the child's face, grimy, exhausted, and smiling anyway. In a ship wrapped in black composites and silence, Elira Vance awoke to the taste of salt and ash in her mouth. Her dreams had been violent. She remembered flashes of fire, of glass shattering in vacuum, of her hands around someone's throat. She couldn't say whose. She sat up slowly, joints cracking in protest, and blinked away the remnants of cold sleep. Her hair was longer than regulation fitting since she hadn't worn a uniform in 6 years. Silver traced through the black like frost on midnight steel. She stretched, flexed, and ran diagnostics on her joints. No slush damage. No cognitive lag. Good. The reactivation routines had held. The ship was small, an older model diplomatic courier modified for black ops exfiltration. Twin ion skimmers, grav displacement nodes buried under radiation dampening hull. Standard weaponless diplomatic ID, but with a shadow core module that could disappear it from orbital scans for up to 18 minutes. Her last ride off the grid. She padded barefoot to the main cabin where a single packet of synth coffee and a datapad waited on the console. The hum of the ship was low, intimate, like a heartbeat she hadn't heard in years. A note blinked in blue. Briefing, eyes only. Priority Alpha. Welcome back, Ash. She scowled at the name. No one had called her that in years. Not since the last PSYOP campaign she ran on the Varan reaches. Not since she left after Barkan Prime. Barkan. Gods, she could still smell the scorched bone and ozone. She tapped the pad. The hologram flickered to life. Fleet Admiral Reiko Nada stared back at her, lips pressed into a grim line, dark eyes ringed with sleepless fire. We've got a problem, Ash. A big one. Back in the archive hall, Vural summoned 3 trusted junior scholars and locked the neural uplink grid to isolation mode, a violation of at least 4 Concordat statutes and punishable by forced memory segmentation. "I need your eyes," he said. "Your honesty. And your discretion." They were loyal. Or curious. Sometimes the two looked the same. One by one, he fed them pieces of the puzzle, images, words, moments captured by humans themselves. Not propaganda. Not broadcasts meant for alien ears. Raw, unfiltered transmissions pulled from forgotten corners of the quantum ether. One showed a battlefield medic crying over an enemy soldier as she worked to stabilize him. Her voice cracked in a dialect none of them could quite understand, but the tone was universal. Another showed a human child feeding scraps of meat to an alien refugee from a species that had once bombarded Earth's Martian colonies. The refugee looked confused. The child smiled anyway. The scholars were quiet. They'd all been raised on the standard doctrine. Humans were durable, unrefined, emotionally volatile, and brutally effective. Biological anomalies with preposterous regenerative capacities. Capable of eating raw protein paste and drinking solvent-grade alcohol. Soldiers who screamed while charging and laughed when wounded. Brutes. Finally, one, Iris, a young Krillborn specialist in human xenolinguistics, spoke. "This isn't weakness," she said. "It's calculated openness. Strategic empathy. They're building something in these images. A myth. But not the one we think." Vural nodded. "They taught us to fear them. Told us they were rage and fire in flesh. But that's only part of the truth." "What's the other part?" Iris asked. Vural stared into the darkness of the archive vault, his voice a whisper against the humming crystals. "They chose to seem like monsters." Elira Vance's shuttle slid into lunar orbit under civilian transponder codes. Earth hung below, still blue, still scarred. Half a continent bore the glassy reminder of the Second Contact War. The rest remained defiant, alive, loud. City lights danced across the night side like fireflies over a battlefield. Her landing was unscheduled. Her arrival was unannounced. But as she stepped onto the tarmac of the old Armstrong base, 2 men in UN Diplomatic Corps armor greeted her with stiff salutes. Their armor was matte gray, marked with the Ouroboros insignia of Soul Command, a serpent devouring its own tail, eternally cycling through survival and domination. "Ma'am, the assembly's waiting." She grimaced. "Of course they are." In the car, a sleek hovercraft with military-grade dampeners, one of the escorts turned slightly. "Is it true what they're saying? That the Concordat found something?" Elira's gaze stayed locked on the horizon. The curve of Earth peaked above the base's atmospheric dome. "They found enough." Inside the Earth Assembly's underground war chamber where old Cold War bunkers had been refitted with alien alloys, psi-shielding, and anti-scry lattice, 50 of humanity's best minds waited. Military, diplomatic, psychological, cultural warfare. The room was ringed in obsidian-tinted glass that doubled as passive threat analysis displays. Red bands glowed faintly around a half-dozen sectors of space. Reiko stood at the center. "Vance," she said, voice low and hard. "We brought you back because this lie you helped build is collapsing." Elira didn't flinch. "Then it's time we remind the galaxy why we told it in the first place." A murmuring spread through the room. One woman in the back, Dr. Sena Karpov, cultural attaché, stood. "You want to double down on a lie that cost us entire generations of trust. That forced our own children to grow up believing we were monsters." "They were safe," Elira replied. "Because the galaxy was afraid to test them." Reiko raised her hand. "Sitrep," she said. "The Thal VYX scholar Vural is pushing a quiet investigation into the real human psyche. He's credible. He has influence. If he makes his findings public, we lose our edge," Elira said. "No," Reiko corrected. "We lose our protection." Vural's message reached 3 worlds before the sensors caught it. Each one responded differently. The Arxal Communion, old enemies of Earth who had once lost a third of their orbital fleets over Ganymede, began quiet mobilization drills. The Jelton Combine requested emergency diplomatic talks, citing Clause 12.9 of the Concordat Integrity Treaty. The Corin Hive sent a single communique. "Your deception is noted." Vural was arrested 2 days later, under suspicion of cultural destabilization. His last act before detainment was sending a backup of his findings to a non-governmental contact. A journalist, an alien-born, human-educated journalist with ties to 6 major relay networks. Back on Earth, Elira Vance prepared for departure. The assembly had authorized her with a roaming brief, unlimited discretion to maintain psychological deterrence. She knew what that meant. She suited up slowly, each piece of old armor clicking into place. The inside of the chest plate still bore the burn mark from the Varan campaign. Her fingers hesitated only once, over the engraved names etched beneath the collar. One of them was Denev's brother. "We're not the Orcs," she muttered, latching her case closed. "We just wore the mask." Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Gray-streaked hair, scars like spiderwebs, eyes too tired to lie anymore. The door opened behind her. A voice said, "You're really going to lean back into the myth?" She turned. It was Commander Denev, her old protégé. He looked softer now. Diplomatic postings had dulled his edge, rounded the sharp instincts she once trusted. "I'm going to do what I always do," she said. "What humanity needs." He hesitated. "And if that means letting the galaxy think we're monsters again?" She stepped past him. "Then we remind them why they were afraid." In a prison cell deep beneath the Concordat's inner moon, Vural sat alone, cold and smiling. Because monsters wear masks, but so do heroes. And sometimes, the difference is just who writes the story. There were 6 trillion sentient beings in the Concordat, and in the last 48 hours, more than 1 billion of them had seen the leak. It spread like a virus through the subnetworks, past firewalls and thought filters, leaping between commercial relays and pirate mirrors. Entire planets went dark in panicked attempts to contain it. It was too late. Vural's cache, the poetry, the images, the raw emotional spectrum of humanity in its quietest moments had burned through the stars. And it was setting the galaxy on fire. Elira Vance stepped off the dropcraft and into a boiling diplomatic hellstorm. The outermost moon of Hesek 3 was technically neutral ground. Concordat dignitaries met here when they didn't want censors listening. The whole place reeked of polite paranoia. Sterile corridors, drone perimeter security, rooms woven with psychic dampeners and legal ambiguity. The air even smelled filtered. She walked under escort, her armor half disguised beneath formal attire. Her boots echoed on the white stone floor, a sound designed to carry. Her presence alone was enough to draw attention. She wasn't just a human envoy, she was Elira Vance, the architect of Earth's mythos. The Iron Spectre. The tactician behind the orbital inversion at Terra's 5. The one who smiled through blood and made fear into doctrine. A dozen species watched her from behind tinted glass, whispering in tongues both spoken and signaled. Their eyes didn't hold contempt. Not anymore. They held fear. At the end of the corridor stood a Corran sentinel, 2.5 meters of carapace, shadow chitin, and organic lattice weaponry. Its voice rasped like a glacier calving. "Envoy Vance, the assembly awaits." Elira nodded once. "Let them wait another 10 seconds. Remind them who I am." The sentinel tilted its head. "Your reputation precedes you." "Good," she muttered. "That means they remember the Gantt spiral." The sentinel did not reply, but it stepped aside. She entered the chamber like a wolf walking through a firebreak. Around her, the highest council of the Concordat, 25 beings from 19 species, sat in elevated alcoves. Holograms shimmered above each seat, translating expressions and data in real time. Political thermographs flared with heat. Elira stopped at the center of the chamber where the floor bore the ancient sigil of peaceful assembly, a circle broken only by a single diagonal slash. The symbol for compromise. Or warning. "You summoned me," she said. "Here I am." A Varaxi speaker, all translucent musculature and liquid cores, leaned forward. Its voice bubbled through a filtration collar. "We have reviewed the transmissions. They are not fictions." "No," she agreed. "They're worse. They're truth." Murmurs. Shifting limbs. Glances exchanged. "And you admit it," a Thal VYX delegate hissed. Its mandibles flared. "We never denied it," Elira replied. "We just let you believe what you needed to. The galaxy wanted monsters. You were more comfortable fearing us than understanding us." The Corran delegate's voice was like a bone cracking. Its mouth parts split along 4 axes. "That myth protected your kind. That myth kept yours from testing how far we go." The Arxel representative slammed a clawed appendage against its lectern. "Then Earth must issue a formal apology and denounce the myth. Publicly. Or you will face full trade sanctions and military quarantine of your border systems." Elira turned to face the entire room. Her voice was steady, but her hands curled slightly. "It's not a confession," she said. "It's a reminder. On a minor orbital relay station near the fringe of Concordat space, a journalist named Silket Own watched the fallout unfold in real time. They were gelatin, soft-skinned, four-eyed, and surgically calm under pressure. They'd lived on Earth for 9 standard years, studied at universities built over old war ruins, and fallen in love twice with human poets. They knew the species better than most Concordat-born citizens. Now they were the galaxy's most wanted information vector. Silket exhaled slowly and checked the latest heat map overlay. Red flashes marked sectors in media lockdown. Dozens. More coming. Entire academies were being purged of human-centric data. Public feeds replaced with calming cycles, neutral emotional wavelengths, synthetic news drones. It wouldn't work. Truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Their translator pinged with a message. It was from an anonymous node encoded in an old Terran dialect. You publish truth. You know what comes next. Silket tapped a reply. I didn't do it to provoke war. Then you should not have told the story of a people who were forged by it. They stared at the words for a long time. The glow from the monitor reflected in all 4 eyes. Forged by war, they murmured. But born of hope. You didn't see the camps. I did. They pulled up one of the leaked vids, a human man handing a ration bar to an alien child in a shattered dome, his hands shaking, his face smeared with blood. The man had smiled. Not because things were okay, but because the child was alive. Silket hit broadcast. One more share. Another 100,000 views. Then another million. Let the truth burn brighter. Elira Vance sat alone in the temporary Earth consulate quarters, watching the storm gather in orbit. 6 fleets had repositioned in the last 12 hours. Not full mobilizations, not yet, but posturing. The Vrachi Vortex fleet had taken up position over Signan Belt space. The Jolari Sentinels were shadowing Earth's trade arteries. The Red Banner Armada, Arxel's most decorated war fleet, was parked in full formation over the disputed moon of Sindhura 4. Like raptors circling something they weren't sure was dead yet. She sipped recycled coffee. It tasted like memory and grit. She tapped into the secured line. Reiko appeared, pale and lined. The background behind her flickered with stress alerts and strategic threat pulses. They won't act yet, Reiko said. But they're thinking about it. Good, Elira murmured. Let them remember how dangerous thinking about humans has always been. Reiko sighed. I hope to God you still believe we're not monsters. Elira didn't answer right away. She looked past the display into the dark. Memories searched. She was 24, boots caked with Martian dust, watching a child wrap their arms around her after she pulled them from a collapsed shelter. The child hadn't cried. Just held her tight, trembling. We aren't, Elira finally said. But sometimes being seen as one is the only way to keep your children safe. A long silence passed. I lost 3 teams on Nerix, Reiko finally said. Because they believed the myth too hard. Laughed at pain. Tried to be what the galaxy feared. It got them killed. Then maybe it's time we evolve the myth, Elira said. Not retreat from it. Weaponize truth, not just terror. The feed cut. Elira leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered to the silence. Let the mask burn. Let them see what we really are. And if they flinch? Then they were never ready for peace. In the dark cells beneath Concordat Intelligence Headquarters, Vural sat strapped to a truth cradle. Neural inhibitors blinked red around his temples. The air was sharp with memory excision fields. Cold sweat pooled in the dips of his clavicles. The machine above him hummed with quiet cruelty. A tall figure entered the room. Gelton. Familiar. Silket Own. You're risking everything by coming here, Vural rasped. Silket nodded. I came as a trade courier. The badge was real. The identity, less so. Vural's eyes, dim but resolute, met Silket's. They'll follow you. Let them, Silket said. Truth doesn't care about risk. It cares about voice. They placed a small neural patch on the side of the truth cradle. It glowed faintly. Live relay, Silket said. Your story. Your voice. One last time. Vural exhaled. Then let them hear ours. The lights dimmed. Somewhere, the sound of distant alarms began to echo. The fire had started. The truth had always been a weapon. Now it was on every major broadcast relay in the Concordat. Vural's voice, dry, weary, but cutting like glass, spoke in perfect high Concordat as the neural relay carried his testimony from the depths of the intelligence compound. Silket had synchronized the stream through 1,000 shadow relays, bouncing across dead bandwidths and pirate nets, until the feed appeared in the middle of trade broadcasts, art exhibitions, and even a live championship hoverball match on Nuatel Prime. You called them monsters. You asked why they laughed in war, why they charged in fire, Why they bleed for strangers. I have studied them for half a lifetime, and now I understand humanity is not what you think. They are not beasts. They are not demons. They are not even heroes. They are something far worse. They are honest. Every war mask they wore, they made it themselves, and wore it not to deceive you but to protect themselves. From you, from us, from what we might do, if we thought they were weak. Alira Vance stood in the Earth Consulate's command deck, surrounded by silence. The playback flickered across 10 hollow panels. Vural's words rang through static like gospel delivered by a condemned prophet. Diplomats, officers, and analysts stood frozen, their faces awash in the glow. She saw them all reflected in the glass. The analysts who wrote simulations about alien aggression, the strategists who taught fear as doctrine. They weren't watching Vural. They were watching themselves. Reiko's voice came through the primary channel, sharp and wired with tension. That bastard actually did it. Alira didn't answer. We thought he'd leak files, analysis, old feeds. But this is a confession, a reversal. He just handed them our entire psychological doctrine on a silver platter. No, Alira said, quietly. He handed them a mirror. Let's see who panics first. On Gallon Station, riots broke out within minutes. The Varaxi Commerce Syndicate issued a directive banning all human ships from their ports, claiming cultural deception and psychological contamination. 14 human freighters were impounded. One crew was dragged out live on broadcast, their expressions unreadable behind mirrored visors. But in the lower rings of the station, where the working class lived, alien and human together, far from the council towers and polished speech halls, something strange happened. The people rewatched the stream, over and over, and they understood it. Humans hadn't lied. They'd performed. For safety, for survival, for deterrence, for peace bought at the edge of a myth. In a grime-lined dining hall, under the hum of flickering lights, a dozen species sat shoulder to shoulder. A Illith cleaner passed a drink to a retired human loader. A krill worker offered an old Earth coin to a child who had dropped their meal token. And an old Koran matron, thick-shelled and heavy-jawed, spoke on a communal forum. Her voice was gravel in the translation feed. They roared so we wouldn't make them scream. Silket Own knew their life expectancy had dropped below statistical viability. They moved through shadow ports, changing appearances via pulse mimic tech every 90 minutes. Each step away from the intelligence sector cost favors, currency, leverage, and sometimes blood. They'd already left behind a datapad with a dead man's credentials, and a promise to a friend they could never repay. At Station Halritha's edge, they ducked through a failed checkpoint, only to see a Concordat patrol vessel descend past the frost line. They froze in the shadows of an exhaust vent as a searchlight swept overhead. A single drone paused, hovering, humming, before drifting away. Silket waited until the silence returned. Then they ran. At a refueling station outside the Vashtin corridor, Silket found a broadcast room. No guards, no noise, just a cracked console, a rusted access point, and a single broadcast beacon, partially buried in ice. They sat down and looked into the camera. A beat passed. The room trembled slightly as a docking arm shifted outside the hull. My name is Silket Own, and I am the one who gave Vural his voice. They exhaled. And if the Concordat silences me now, it will only prove him right. They ended the feed, and waited, and somewhere, across the galactic night, their words sparked another fire. Inside the Concordat assembly chambers, the walls were bleeding light. Emergency sessions had been called. The Thalvyx demanded a declaration of informational warfare. The Arxel wanted sanctions tripled. The Jelton argued for calm. The Illith offered a compromise that smelled suspiciously like a disarmament clause aimed solely at humanity. The chamber itself, a ring of crystalline resonance and symbiotic architecture, vibrated with tension. Each species' voice altered the room's light signature. The colors pulsed red, violet, and angry gold. Alira Vance sat at the Earth delegation desk, alone. Then she stood. You wanted the myth gone? She said. Fine, let's tear it down. But you don't get to decide what we are next. Silence. A static hum. You can fear us, or you can know us. But you don't get both. She pulled a data chip from her sleeve. As she moved, her fingers hesitated. Just for a moment. Her mind flashed back to a name etched in bronze. Lieutenant Arun Kale. He died shielding a dozen alien children during the Aralyn offensive. He told a joke while bleeding out. She inserted the chip into the chamber's shared broadcast terminal. Here's our real cultural doctrine. Everything you thought we hid, we didn't. We recorded it. You just weren't listening. Images flooded the chamber. Human doctors working on alien battlefields. Children singing in broken stations under oxygen domes. Soldiers dying, not for glory, but for each other, often with laughter on their lips. This is who we are, Elira said. All of it. The rage, the sacrifice, the jokes in the dark, the fury, the kindness. The mask was never a lie. It was a choice, one you forced us to make. A long silence followed. For once, not a single diplomat spoke. Then the Corin delegate clicked once. And if we still choose to fear you? Elira met their gaze. Then we'll wear the mask again. But this time you will know what it cost us. On Earth, people watched the stream. In bars. In bunkers. In arcology towers layered in neon. In burned cities and overgrown colonies where moss grew over old battle mechs. Some watched with pride. Others with grief. Many with tears. In a frozen outpost on Mars, a mechanic paused mid-repair. Her knuckles were raw. The patch on her jacket bore a single name, her brother's. She wiped her hands on her sleeve and whispered, "They finally told the truth." And for the first time in a century, humanity saw itself not through fear or glory or legend, but through truth. Human, monstrous, glorious, and real. The galaxy flinched. Not all at once. Not in a single place. But in fractures, cracks spiderwebbing through treaties and power blocks, alliances, and assumptions. Ural's message and Elira's reply had shattered the illusion the Concordat relied on for balance, that humanity could be feared but never fully understood. Now they were beginning to understand. And some of them didn't like what they saw. Aboard the Arxel warcruiser Charax Ma, High Strategos Kilvek stared at the grainy footage of the Earth assembly feed. Elira Vance's final words echoed again through the chamber. Then we'll wear the mask again. But this time you will know what it cost us. Kilvek's scales flared slightly with tension. The bridge crew, all veterans of the Ganymede fireline, shifted uneasily. They remembered the last time the humans wore the mask. Whole divisions burned beneath orbital rifts. Civilian populations willingly immolating supply depots just to deny them ground. Cities buried themselves to deny invaders the pleasure of conquest. Kilvek's second-in-command hissed, "This is not a plea. This is a challenge." "It always was," Kilvek replied. "They never stopped being the threat. We just convinced ourselves they were civilized." He keyed in a directive. Red light swept across the bridge as battle protocols initialized. The Red Banner Armada's drives began to power. Toward the Sindhura line. Toward Earth space. War drums. No longer ceremonial. Now kinetic. In the skies above Falsharam, the Vrachi Vortex fleet realigned its formations. Ostensibly a defensive maneuver. But the old codes buried in their flagship's transmission, a flickering pulse in the frequency used during the Second Contact War, carried a different message. We believe the myth more than the truth. Across 9 systems, Vrachi civilian broadcasts were interrupted by emergency declarations. Planetary militias were reactivated. Orbital rings were reinforced. Their prime archivist, Oral Vexen, gave a single televised address. The humans have shown their face. And it is made of scars. Let none be surprised when the scream follows the warning growl. Elira Vance watched the incoming data cascade across her terminal like blood pouring from an open wound. Fleet redeployments. Clandestine threats. Economic sanctions. Propaganda campaigns twisting Vural's message into something monstrous. Images re-edited to show humans grinning through flames, stripped of context. A headline from the Arxel media grid scrolled by. Monsters revealed, Earth declares cultural dominance. Another from a neutral Concordat world. They lie to protect U.S. or to study U.S. Reiko's voice crackled over a secure line. Some of them would rather fight the version of us they think they understand than face the real one. Elira didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on a single blinking alert. Operation Hollow Veil contingency status unlocked. In the corner of her screen, the system chimed softly a biometric key code request. Her pulse elevated just enough to confirm authorization. She didn't move immediately. She thought of Barkin Prime, of a young officer who froze during an orbital breach and died screaming as Elira pulled 2 children to safety. Of the fear in their eyes. Not of the enemy. Of her. That was the day she learned how powerful fear could be and how to shape it. They want orcs, she said at last. Let's show them what restraint costs. Reiko hesitated. Are you sure? Once Hollow Veil goes active, there's no putting it back in the box. Elira exhaled slowly. I never wanted to be feared again. But I will not let them make monsters of us without remembering what monsters do when cornered. Reiko's voice dropped. You were always better at being the mask than I was. I wore it so you wouldn't have to, Elira said. But now it's time they see who made it. In a forgotten sector of soul space, beneath Europa's cracked shell, the first Terran Dreadform ships awakened. The bay was a hollowed cylinder deep beneath the glacial crust, invisible to orbital scan and wrapped in carbon sponge telemetry dampeners. The station's internal AI, not conscious, not sentient, but deeply obedient, spooled ancient bioprints into ignition sequences. The ships were not constructed. They were grown. Black-veined hulls pulsed like hearts. Armor refracted not just light but intent, disrupting targeting systems through fear response biofeedback. Crews entered through muscle-tight sealed chambers that smelled of antiseptic and marrow. These were not diplomatic vessels. These were not science ships. They were wolves born in a kennel of graves. They had no names. Only call signs. Cerberus. Aegisburn. Blackrook. Hollow Veil Prime. One by one, their reactors came online. Low. Hungry. Patient. Their captains did not speak. Because they were trained not to negotiate. They were trained to end. Somewhere in deep space, in the burnt ruins of a long-abandoned Gelton outpost, Silket Own watched the Dreadform telemetry pulse across their hijacked feed. They trembled. Not of fear of humanity, but of the silence that followed the awakening. They had wanted to expose the truth. To stop the lie. But now the galaxy was panicking and Silket couldn't help but wonder. Had they pulled the trigger on a war born not from malice but misunderstanding? The galaxy had asked for monsters. And humanity, ever the adaptable species, had simply replied. Which kind? Far above Europa, a Keltari scout ship picked up the Dreadform activation signature. The pilot was Junior, barely a rotation into his post. He stared as the sensor returns resolved, not steel or thruster trails, but something alive streaking into the void. He didn't finish his report. The feed cut as the Dreadform ships accelerated. The last word transmitted. Run. The Concordat convened a high-threat assembly within 20 hours. It had only been invoked twice in history, once during the Eridon Plague and once when the Blackwell Singularity threatened to consume 3 star systems. This time, they invoked it for Earth. Inside the chamber, alien leaders shouted, whispered, flared, or clicked, depending on anatomy and anxiety. Civil militarization thresholds were debated. Some wanted sanctions. Others, preemptive strikes. A few, not many but enough, demanded immediate diplomatic re-engagement. Elira did not speak. She only stood, watched, and let them play out their own nightmare. At last, a Vrachi elder, bent and rust-colored, with gillfolds tight from stress, turned toward her. If you deploy these Dreadforms, will they discriminate between soldiers and civilians? Elira's eyes were calm, quiet, and ancient. Only if you make them. On Earth, inside a command bunker beneath Old Tokyo, Reiko stood before a table of generals and historians. Behind her, flickering on a massive display wall, were dozens of colonial system feeds, protests, fear, some rage, but also solidarity. Alien refugees defending human embassies. Mixed families holding vigils. Veterans from 20 species volunteering to speak on behalf of Earth. In one uplink feed, a young Scarali boy stood in front of a human school holding a sign that read, I am not afraid of my friends. Reiko turned slowly. They think we are orcs again, she said. One general chuckled. Maybe it's time we show them what orcs really are. Reiko smiled thinly. Then let's remind them. Orcs don't just burn villages. They protect their own. They endure. They fight to the last. And if you corner them, gods help you. Above Europa, the Dreadforms lifted. Black wings stretched against the void. A message pulsed out across all Concordat bands. You wanted monsters. You will now negotiate with the ones you made. And for the first time in 100 years, the galaxy remembered. No one survives humanity clean. The Dreadforms did not enter orbit. They punched into it. Over the ice fields of Kestra 9, Vrachii gun platforms rotated to track the incoming contacts. The platforms had repelled pirates, solar flares, even a full-scale Orcsal incursion. They didn't last 6 seconds. The Dreforms didn't fire rail guns or plasma. They ruptured light itself, compressing void around gravitic cores and flinging localized black wave pulses that destabilized shielding before melting hull. One Dreadform skimmed a relay tower at Mach 14, carving a silence across 2 kilometers like a surgeon's blade. No debris. Just absence. The command crew didn't scream. They had no time. No warning. One blink and their voices were gone. Within minutes, the Kestran perimeter was blind. An entire defense array, 30 years in the making, wiped clean like breath from a mirror. And the message was clear. We are not here to argue. We are here to remind. Elira Vance stood aboard Hollow Veil Prime, its bridge lit in dark crimson from threat-level protocols. She watched the data ripple across system feeds. Fleet movement, panic spikes in Vrachii civilian nets, hundreds of new psi-stress anomalies flagged in Concordat analyst traffic. She felt none of the old adrenaline. No satisfaction. Just inevitability. She'd hoped they'd never open the vault. Never trigger the dread forms. But hope, she reminded herself, was a dangerous illusion in the hands of strategists. You didn't plan for peace. You endured it. And waited for when the stars turned cold. A calm ping broke the silence. It was Reiko. The Concordat just called for an emergency ceasefire summit. They want to negotiate, but they're demanding the Drev forms stand down. Elira exhaled. And 3 member states say they'll walk if the summit includes humans. A flicker of rage. Not the explosive kind. The cold kind. The kind she wore like armor. They want to talk about us. But not to us. As always, Reiko said. Elira turned from the console. She walked past the viewing bay where Hollow Veil's crew stood silent, waiting. Let them hold their summit, she said. But the Dreforms stay in play. I want every jump gate from Sol to the Haldron Reach shadow-mapped. If they even think about isolating Earth, I want to know before their diplomats finish the first sentence. Reiko paused. You think they'll try to strike first? No, Elira said, eyes narrowing. I think they'll try to erase the truth. And if that happens, we remind them what truth tastes like with a broken jaw. She ended the call, and for a moment, just a breath, her hands trembled. Just once. Then stilled. The war mask settling back over the part of her that still remembered the child she pulled from fire on Barkan Prime. The child who hadn't cried until Elira smiled. Elsewhere, on a neutral orbital station above Gentari Prime, Silkit Own gave their first live interview since the broadcast. The station was awash in tension. Crowds gathered behind press barriers, a mix of protest and protection. Silkit wore a plain cloak, no translation implant, only their voice. The interviewer, a Illith diplomat with a voice like sliding metal, asked, "Do you regret starting this?" Silkit blinked. Slowly. Calmly. I didn't start it. I just showed it to everyone. And they did what they always do when faced with something human, they panicked. The diplomat clicked in disapproval. You say that as if humans are not dangerous. They are, Silkit said. But so is a mother defending her children. So is a fire lit to keep the dark at bay. You think the dread forms are proof of savagery. I think they're proof of restraint. Because if that is what they kept hidden, ask yourself what would have happened if they hadn't. The room held still. Across the galaxy, responses varied. On Draven 6, a group of scholars canceled their symposium and began circulating a petition for full human inclusion. On Luris Station, a military commentator declared Silkit a traitor and called for preemptive war. In the border world of Kelth, a mural appeared overnight, a human soldier handing a blanket to an alien child with the words "We were never the Orcs" stenciled beneath. In that pause, across half the galaxy, people watched and listened. Not all agreed, but none forgot. On the edge of the Talon expanse, Arxal Commander Threx silenced his bridge with a raised claw. He'd seen the dread forms in action. He'd read Vural's leaked transcript. And now he watched as a lone Terran diplomatic frigate approached under flag of truth protocols. Its hull bore no weapons. Only an old Terran glyph, a serpent eating its own tail. What do they want? His lieutenant asked. Threx bared his teeth. Not in anger. In thought. The one thing no monster is ever expected to offer. Which is forgiveness. He paused. His claws flexed once. And if not forgiveness, then understanding. The most dangerous gift of all. The lieutenant narrowed his eyes. Sir, shall we intercept? Threx looked once more at the screen. If we shoot, we confirm the myth. And if we listen? Threx didn't answer for a long time. Then maybe we become something else too. Above the neutral world of Heron's Fall, thousands gathered in vigil. Humans and non-humans. Veterans and refugees. The planet had no strategic value. No defenses. Just memory. They lit fires. Some sang. One child, Sren, age 9, a Zalari refugee with burn scars on one cheek, stood beside his adoptive human father, clutching a patch from the Terran Peace Corps. And above them, streaking across the night sky, one dread form passed overhead. It did not descend. It did not threaten. It watched. Because not all monsters crave blood. Some just want to know they were seen. And in the silence that followed, Sren whispered to the sky. "We see you." The diplomatic frigate Solace 9 drifted into Concordat orbit like a ghost wearing a peace banner. No escorts. No dread forms. Just a single Terran vessel wrapped in unencrypted transmissions broadcasting one line in every known language. "We are not here to bow. We are here to be heard." Terran Elric had never felt fear like this. And he was no stranger to fear. He'd served 2 tours in the refugee corridors after the Sol Crimson collapse. He'd watched children pull shards from their arms to help others first. He'd negotiated the Iktari crisis with nothing but a damaged translator and a knife scar through his ribs. But this was different. Because this time it wasn't about saving lives. It was about telling the truth in a room built to forget it. He paused just inside the airlock. The seal hissed shut behind him. He closed his eyes for a breath. A memory surfaced, a boy no older than 10 holding the hand of his sister in the aftermath of a dome collapse, whispering, "They said humans don't cry. But you are." He'd smiled through tears and told the child, "We cry for what we won't let die." He opened his eyes and walked into history. The Concordat Summit Hall was engineered for awe and intimidation. Suspended in zero gravity inside a carved asteroid known as Gavel-Core, the chamber floated above the neutral moon of Rethprim, the gravitational field controlled by nested lattice pulses and ionic thrusters. Delegates were already seated when Solace 9 docked. Each species had its own section, bio-optimized for their physiology. The Arxal chamber pulsed faintly with pheromone suppression fields, their war-hardened forms coiled in restless stasis. The Vrachi shimmered with active spectrum neural filters to control stress coloration. The Corin delegates, ever unmoving, projected thought-mirroring overlays in soft pulses of colorless light. Overhead, the room's central spire cycled soft ambient thermals to suppress outbursts. It made the air feel thick to humans. Terran walked in alone. No guards. No armor. No weapons. Only his voice. "My name is Terran Elric," he said. "Human envoy. I come under truth protocols and the protection of all present. I speak not as a soldier, but as a witness." The chamber fell into biochemical silence, a stillness even deeper than quiet. Then the Illith delegate rose, its robes rustling like foil, gill veins flaring in an iridescent signal of offense. "You unleash dread forms upon sovereign sectors and claim to be witnesses?" Terran didn't flinch. He stood on the central platform, encircled by the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. "Yes. Witnesses to your fear. And to your silence." The chamber responded like a living organism. Heated murmurs triggered automatic thermal dispersal. A vibration of intent radiated from the Corin. Terran took another step forward. "For decades you called us orcs. Brutes. Beasts. You traded with us. Armed us. Lied to us. Feared us. But never once did you try to know us. Not really. Because if you had, you'd have seen that the only reason we wore the mask was to protect you from what we were forced to become." "And what are you?" hissed the Thalvyx, a voice like boiling oil. Terran met their gaze without blinking. "We are what you made us. But we are also what we chose to be despite you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. It was a photo, laminated, old, weathered by heat and time. A human soldier, gaunt and soot-covered, cradling a krill hatchling wrapped in foil and torn fabric. The child's eyes wide. The soldier smiling. "This is what you fear? Not the dread forms. Not our war. You fear this." He held it high. "You fear the possibility that we never were the monsters. That we were simply the ones who survived yours." The response was not verbal. It was instinctual. The Vrachi dimmed into defensive hue. The Thalvyx vibrated their limb casings. The Arxal's muscles flexed like drawn wires. Even the Corin's projection briefly flared with unreadable static. Fear. And maybe recognition. Somewhere in the chamber, a Corin speaker pulsed a subtle shift in color, the equivalent of leaning forward. "Then why now? Why the dread forms?" Terran lowered the photo. "Because when someone keeps calling you a beast, one day, to stop the knife from coming again, you growl. And when that doesn't work, you show your teeth. But it doesn't mean you wanted to bite. A silence followed. Deep. Measured. Then from the Arxal quadrant, so what do you want? Terran let the words fall like a slow avalanche. Recognition. Not just of our sovereignty. He raised his eyes to the dome. Recognition of our truth. He turned. Call off your fleets. Burn your propaganda. Acknowledge the broadcasts. Let Vural speak freely. Let Silkit return home. Let Alira walk among you without escort. Let your children read about Terran history uncensored. He let the echo carry. Do that and we stand down. A long breath from the Vrachi. Their colors twisted in confusion, resolve, and something close to pain. And if we refuse? Terran's voice dropped. Then the Dreadforms will not ask again. The chamber hovered at the edge of reaction. It didn't erupt. It tightened. Like a net pulled taut. Then, from the back, a single voice. A Zalari diplomat, young by their standards, tremulous and soft-spined. I lost my brother at Terra's 5. We believed the myth. Hated you. But I've seen what we made you become. I vote to listen. Another voice. A veteran of the Vrachi interventions, I fought Terrans. They bled for each other. I never understood it until now. A scholar, let us not fear knowledge. If they are monsters, let us prove it with truth, not stories. The Illith, silent now. The Thalvyx glared, but said nothing. A crack. In the wall. In the myth. And in orbit above, the Dreadforms remained perfectly still. They made no threats. They watched. Because humans were not the Orcs. They were something much worse. They were remembered. They say the stars burned a little colder the day the Concordat cracked. Not shattered. Not broken. Just enough. Just a hairline fracture down the middle of certainty. For the first time in over a century, the unity forged by fear of humanity was replaced by something far more volatile. Doubt. In the orbiting observation spire above Gavel Core, Alira Vance stood with Reiko Suda beneath a vaulted array of transparent alloy. The stars beyond looked too clean to belong to the same galaxy that had birthed the last 5 wars. The room, known as the Halo Chamber, was a diplomatic neutral ground. No armed guards. No listening drones. Just filtered silence and raw starlight. The ceiling was inscribed with treaties long past, each etched in layered crystalline bands readable only by species whose sight could split light into language. At the far end of the chamber, a sculpture hung weightless, a depiction of a burning bridge held in place by the hands of 20 species. Once it had symbolized hope. Now it trembled in the subtle thrumming of incoming fleet transmissions. 3 systems open their archives, Reiko murmured, scrolling a holographic display. Her voice barely broke the chamber's hushed reverence. They've uncensored the Terra's 5 footage, the ones showing human medics holding position under artillery fire. One even uploaded the footage to public ConcordNet. Alira didn't look at the feed. Her gaze remained locked on the arc of Gavel Core below, spinning like a jeweled executioner's blade. And the rest. 8 more are demanding cultural inquiry commissions. One wants to establish a neutral tribunal to verify Terran history. Reiko snorted. 2 have issued new propaganda painting Terran speech as psychological warfare, calling it a synthetic empathy weapon. And the Thalvyx? Reiko tapped the screen. A map flared up, red and twitching. Mobilizing. Quietly. Their fleets are routing through diplomatic corridors, but their subspace broadcasts are encrypted to hell. Signal fuzz matches cold wave encryption. They're planning something. Alira folded her arms. That's not diplomacy. That's a shadow war warming up. Reiko nodded. And the Vrachi? Alira turned. Her voice dropped. They're the embers, burnt on the edges, still deciding whether to rekindle or blow themselves out. Across the galaxy, in the great city ring of Sinmarith, the Vrachi historian Yevon Sok sat before an audience of thousands, streaming live across over 100 systems. Her scales pulsed an amber blue, a hue reserved for mourning and confession. The architecture around her was ancient, open, and flooded with cool mistlight refracted through memory silks. Fabrics coated with the encoded voices of former scholars. Every whisper of movement carried echoes of the past. I have taught 5 generations that humanity could not be trusted, she said softly. I told them they burned without cause, that they grinned at war, that they enjoyed the violence. She looked directly into the lens. Her second eyelids blinked in unison. I was wrong. The chamber erupted, some in cheers, some in outrage. Protesters shouted from balconies. Elders whispered furiously into translation nodes. But history had already shifted beneath them. Sock continued. We feared them so much that we made a myth. But myths demand sacrifices. And every generation that followed burned a little more truth just to keep the story alive. She paused. I once silenced a student who asked about the Terran ceasefire on Rail 9. I called it misinformation. I made her feel small for wanting to believe in mercy. Her scales shimmered with grief. She transferred to an off-world archive. She never came back. Another pause. No more. And in that moment, millions across the galaxy saw something more dangerous than fire. Remorse. In a modest apartment complex orbiting Charthan's reach, a Thalvyx nurse paused in her rounds to watch the replay. Her patients were asleep. The lights dimmed. On the screen, Alira's image froze mid-sentence. That calm human gaze staring into history. The nurse blinked, her fingers trembling on the monitor. She had lost cousins to the Terran expansion war. Had fed stories to her daughter about monsters in helmets. But now, she whispered to no one. They bleed like us. And something in her voice cracked. She stood for a moment longer, then resumed her rounds. But her hands never stopped shaking. Far from the stage and ceremony, Silkadone moved through a new city under a false name. The towers of Dirith III glowed with neon pollen clouds and circuit thread banners. Their hair was cropped short, voice lowered. One eye replaced with a visual net implant to distort facial scans. They watched Sock's broadcast from the corner of a chemical-smoked bar in the outer edges of Lurian's belt. The walls vibrated softly with sub-bass reactor hum, and the clientele, mostly exiles and mercs, pretended not to recognize them. Patron nearby raised a glass. You think the humans actually want peace? Silkit didn't answer. The bartender shrugged. I think they want to stop pretending. That's not peace. That's pressure with its mask off. Silkit sipped their drink. Maybe that's what peace really is. Behind them, a projection flickered. Footage of Terran children learning Koran dialects beside alien tutors. Labeled, integration propaganda or genuine outreach. No one changed the channel. Aboard the Arxel dread carrier Bloodwake II, High Commander Kilvek roared as the broadcast played. His command deck pulsed with red glare and rhythmic hums of target locking drills. The air smelled of copper and ozone, tinged with the memory of slaughter. They bowed, he snarled. You let the Orcs into the council chamber and now they preach honor? Lies. His second-in-command hissed. Shall I recall the forward flotillas? Kilvek didn't answer. Instead, he keyed into a private channel. A holofeed flared to life. A black market arms dealer appeared, faceless, encoded. Deliver the weapons to Sector Red 131, Kilvek growled. Civilian outposts, smugglers, merc bands. Target the systems close to Terran protectorates. Destabilize their allies? And make the humans play savior, Kilvek said. We force them to show restraint. We smear them with every life they fail to save. Plasma charges in refugee zones. Backdoor hacks on their relief ships. Force them to choose between survival and image. And the Concordat? Kilvek's eyes burned. They'll either fear the Terrans again, or they'll beg us to finish the job. Alira stood at the edge of the Solace 9's return deck, watching the stars slide past. Her reflection hovered beside them in the glass, half in light, half in void. The observation deck was lined with tributes. Photos, mission patches, insignias from peacekeeping ops and colonial relief efforts. Every object was magnetically affixed, floating symbols of choices made in silence. Terran sat beside her, still pale, but steady. He was reading a message from the Zalari consulate, an invitation to speak before their assembly. It was marked with a simple, shocking word, honorary. Did it work? He asked. Alira didn't answer immediately. Her fingers hovered over the interface. The silence between them was almost sacred. She tapped a comlink. Dreadforms. Status. The console didn't just reply. It vibrated, ever so slightly. Static shimmered down the line before a voice emerged, emotionless but immense. Holding position, passive stance, weapons cold. Alira finally looked at Terran. It didn't end anything, she said, but it changed the question. He blinked. To what? She turned back to the stars. Not whether we're monsters. A pause. But whether the galaxy can survive knowing we're not.